So this part is going to be about Marxist literary and critical theory. Marxist literary and critical theory, or from now on, for succinctness, I will simply refer to it as critical theory. It derives itself from Marx's political economy, or his notion of economics. I should say before we get started that Marxian economic theory has somewhat been discredited now because mainstream economic thought in the late 20th, 21st century has basically put an end to it by empirical means, showing that the value of goods and services does not derive from some kind of material quality, as Marx suggests, but from a psychological equilibrium where supply meets demand. So just to get that out of the way, but nevertheless, from a cultural standpoint, the arts and the humanities and the social sciences still are very big on Marx. They use Marx a great deal as a means of cultural critique. And even though I have my reservations about Marx from a kind of theological standpoint, from a logical, political standpoint, Marxist critical theory is extremely insightful. It's an extremely effective mechanism for dissecting and analysing society, for offering incisive critique. So, where does it all start? It starts with Hegel. It starts with the philosopher Hegel, from whom Marx borrowed many of his fundamental ideas, yet changed them. He kind of inverted them in a sense. So for Hegel, we start off with the idea, which is the thesis. We could say an idea or an ideology or a time frame. Generally, this is all included in the first movement, the thesis. This first movement is followed by an antithesis, the antithesis, which is something which emerges from the first movement but which contradicts it, or which tries to put an end to it. But nevertheless, the fundamental structure of the thesis is contained within the antithesis, but is updated or upgraded somewhat. And then from the antithesis emerges the synthesis, which is somewhat of the antithesis to the antithesis. So when we reach the point of the synthesis, the initial structure which was found in the thesis is no longer present anymore. That has been completely dissolved, it's been sublimated within the process, and now we have something totally new. So when we start off with a thesis, an original idea, this gave birth to the antithesis, but then finally the synthesis, which comes historically from the thesis but now contains kind of no remnant of the thesis in it. Marx likes this idea. He likes this idea of sublimation, of dialectics, as it's called, but Hegel's dialectics is a spiritual form of dialectics. It's based on the notion that ideas form reality. For Marx, reality forms ideas, so it's kind of the opposite way around. Or rather than saying reality, Marx prefers the term materialism. So sometimes we refer to it as dialectical materialism, other times historical materialism, but it's both the same. For Marx, this idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis plays out historically insofar as it's mimicked in the transition from feudalism to capitalism and then on to socialism. So feudalism we could regard as the thesis. In feudalism we have a social system with a hierarchy. There's no competition because everything is established or pre-established by the hierarchy. We have the king and then the lords and the knights and the peasants. Everything's established already. No competition here. Everything's demarcated into everyone's pre-allotted, pre-assigned roles. But this is relatively inefficient from the point of view of production, from economic production, not the most efficient system. The antithesis to this would be capitalism. So capitalism is the antithesis. It contains some of the fundamental features of feudalism, such as hierarchy, more of a plutarchy in capitalism. We have some competition, whereas feudalism had no competition, so it's a little different. The antithesis has upgraded the original idea somewhat. And there's some efficiency. There's a competition and a degree of efficiency, but still you have monopolies emerging, you have kind of a crony capitalism, bribery, things like this, it's corruption. So capitalism has still not reached full efficiency yet. And then Marx's final idea, which is the synthesis, whether or not this is true, but his idea is that from the antithesis of capitalism, we achieve the synthesis of socialism, which is the kind of final goal. So we have the hierarchy, which was present in the original idea of feudalism, completely now destroyed. Everyone has been equalized. Competition has now been destroyed. Everyone is now equal in terms of competition. But the efficiency which the competition or the competitive nature of capitalism built up, the material wealth which was established first by capitalism, now enables a form of equal or purely totally egalitarian efficiency, in the sense that everybody from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs, as Marx would put it. So we have these three systems. One emerges from the other. One is an improvement of the other, and there is a final endpoint to history, or a final telos or goal, which is that of socialism. There are some key differences between what we could regard as traditional or orthodox Marxism and neo-Marxism or cultural Marxism, made famous by the Frankfurt School, people like Walter Benjamin, Theodor Adorno, and others. So in orthodox Marxism, classical Marxism, Marx postulates that we have capitalism, and then followed by a period of revolution, and then followed by socialism. So to move from capitalism, we have to have a revolution, and then we have socialism. So orthodox Marxism, strictly speaking, and doctrinally speaking, would not really agree with countries like the USSR, people like Lenin, also Mao Zedong in China, establishing socialism before it's ready, because they've missed out a whole phase of history. They've gone directly from feudalism to socialism. They've missed out on the capitalism. Although China now, quite interestingly, if we just want to kind of diverge for a second, is doing something quite interesting. They have Chinese state capitalism, so they kind of jumped all the way from feudalism to socialism, and they're kind of recursively filling in the gaps through a kind of the instantiation of an advanced artificial intelligence technocracy, which they're trying to build up now, which is filling in the gaps of what the capitalist phase that they missed failed to address. So this is quite interesting. So that's classical Marxism. We have a revolution and then socialism after capitalism. For cultural Marxism, Western Marxism, they don't necessarily agree to this idea of revolution. They believe that culture itself is sufficient to give us a smooth transition from capitalism all the way to socialism. So the revolution part is unnecessary. We can have something of a more cohesive transition. So why in some cultures did we have feudalism and then we had capitalism, but we failed to achieve socialism? This is one of Marx's key questions. Well, and this is also one of the key components and the foundation to the critical thinking of Western Marxism. The question of why we were unable to move from capitalism. We got somewhat stuck in this kind of never-ending cycle of capitalism. Why could we not move to socialism? Well, the idea is that explained by something called false consciousness. So false consciousness we can ascribe as the negative and pervasive effects of capitalism. In a sense, it attests to the strength of the capitalist ideology, and not just the capitalist economic machine, but also the ideology and the culture which that machine generates. It's so strong and so pervasive into the human way of thinking that we get trapped in it. We get stuck in this desire, this craving for money, this chasing after money, and we kind of lose track of the ultimate goal of politics. So this would be false consciousness. So how does Marx critique this? What's his idea? Well, he says that in nature we own our labor. Okay? In nature, labor is owned by us, the individual. But under capitalism, our labor has been stolen from us. So, if you think about this in this way, we are given money in exchange for labor. But money is a form of cheating, since money is not real. The money is a representation of something real. That, again, is another deep hole of academic debate, but we'll just say it's a representation of something. It's not the thing in itself. and labour Israel, or this is Marx's argument at least, which, as I said at the beginning, is kind of discredited now. But nevertheless, this forms the basis of what's known as his labour theory of value, which goes on to form the economic base, the psychological foundation of his later critique of the superstructure, which is society, culture, and everything else. So, as an effect, as a consequence of this labour theory of value, it's argued that money takes away people's humanity and makes people objects of value. This is known as commodification. And so for this reason, even though capitalism is an improvement, it's an upgrade on feudalism, it's nevertheless evil in Marx's eyes because our humanity has been lost, it's been sublimated within the money system. On a positive note, what Marx does recognise, and what the neo-Marxists also recognise, is that despite the maybe the spiritual inefficiencies of capitalism, there are certain material efficiencies, such as mass production, which is very useful. So if we take the music industry, for example, many modern pop songs, they all kind of sound very similar. I think that's getting more and more true as the years go by. You know, the pop music that the kids are listening to now sounds just, each song sounds just like the one before it. There's no kind of originality or difference. There's no pop music maybe 30, 40 years ago. Each song was more unique. It had more of a distinct flavour to it. Things are not original, they're just a copy of a copy, in the sense that mass production is a copy of a copy. So not only does mass production have a physical or material aspect to it, it also has a psychological and cultural aspect to it also. Hollywood movies, they're all a copy of each other. Even if the movie itself is different in some small aspects or some superficial aspects, the plot line is the same. Horror stories, romance stories, they're all fundamentally the same. Some explosions, spend a few $1 million blowing things up and then everything ends. You have all these kind of Marvel comic book movies now as well. They're all just the same. In the music industry, we have, say, for example, Michael Jackson, and then we have Justin Timberlake, who's like he replicates some of the style of Michael Jackson a little bit, but he's a little different. And then we have Justin Bieber, who replicates some of the style of Justin Timberlake, but he's considerably worse than what Michael Jackson was. So again, we have copying, and it loses its quality every time. So how can we understand this process of copying, of mass production, of cultural mass production, in a kind of more epochal or civilizational sense? Not just in the small time frame of feudal history to capitalist history to socialism, but how can we understand this on the wider scale of civilization itself and in aesthetic philosophy? Well, Aristotle may be a good place to start. For Aristotle, good art shows itself to be false. So I'll say that again. Good art shows itself to be false. So think about that. It's kind of counterintuitive. And it does so through a process called mimesis, which is Greek for copying. Basically, copying or imitation. Imitating that which is obvious. So good art is trying to imitate things which are obvious. But interestingly, things that are often obvious in everyday life we kind of miss. We overlook precisely because they're so obvious. But for Aristotle, the purpose and function of art is to extricate this from reality, the things that we gloss over, by imitating it and kind of ridiculing it through the falseness of the imitation itself. So if we think about this idea in terms of a comparison between classical tragedy, classical ancient Greek tragedy, versus modern television culture or Hollywood culture, in a classical tragedy, we had these kind of fantastic mythological depictions of men fighting against gods on stage. And you had the chorus singing, and but then there was a distance from the stage, and there's the theatre where everybody sat in the auditorium, and people would sit down and they would view this spectacle. Clearly, the actual artwork itself, the theatre, was different from reality. It was, somewhat of an accentuation of real life, because we were dealing with the gods and we're dealing with tragic events and things that wouldn't ordinarily happen in everyday life. So in this sense, there was a distance between the person watching, the spectator, and the art itself. Okay. Nevertheless, there were real human beings with real human concerns in the tragedy, and the tragedy always had a human sentiment or a moral message to it. So for Aristotle, this made it good because there was a distance with everyday life. There was an ability for the people watching to recognize this is not real. But nevertheless, there was also a degree of closeness insofar as there was enough distance for the person to sit back and not take anything personally or not get sucked into the story. But nevertheless, still enough closeness for the person to identify with the story, to maybe learn something from that. Compare this now with modern television culture, where we have things like reality TV, these singing shows where if the winner, if the singer wins, it changes their whole life, or these sports shows or sports competitions, where for some people it is their life. For some people, there is no differentiation between their favorite sports team winning and them being happy in real life. So Aristotle, he'd be very critical of this because, from his point of view, this is not teaching us anything. If anything, this is just increasing our delusion, because there is no critical distance like there is in the classical tragedy, where we can critique and evaluate our own society and our social problems and the causes of such. We're just drawn further into them because all we have is reality TV. So Aristotle is writing thousands of years before Marx, but nevertheless it's this symbiosis between the aesthetic theory of Aristotle and the kind of political theory of Karl Marx, from which the Western Marxists, the neo-Marxists, the Frankfurt School in particular, derive their cultural theory. In particular, we have people such as Walter Benjamin and Theodor Adorno, who speak in favor of the modernist movement. Adorno is more of a postmodernist, I should add, but they're speaking in favor of certain literary and cinematic accomplishments of modernist art and cinema, insofar as modernist art and cinema manages to re-establish this critical distance between the spectator of the art and the person, the actor representing the art itself, in order to allow us to critique and politically evaluate the society itself. So there's just enough similarity in the art for us to draw an identification with it, but there's also a certain critical distance maintained in order to let us think critically and not become too emotionally involved in the artwork. So one example of this would be metafiction. Metafiction is a good modernist strategy in literature. Other techniques include things like fragmentation, absurdity. These all force the reader or the viewer into stopping, experiencing something of a shock, and the shock kind of shocks us out of our everyday habitual pattern of thinking and forces us to think a little harder. So in this sense, art can act as philosophy. It can where philosophy, maybe we're numb to it, maybe we're not used to reading it, art through kind of a actual a gesture, as Brecht would put it, or through a process of conditioned or actual behavioral learning, can actually teach us things that maybe we're not even aware that we realize. It can, in the sense that you can teach a kid just by showing them through gestures without actually explaining to the kid, or without the kid actually understanding why he knows what he knows. You can teach people, or maybe shock people out of their kind of cultural stupor into re-evaluating social principles through these modernist techniques of literature and cinema. The opposite of this, of course, would be television. And Adorno in particular is highly pessimistic. He thinks that low culture, that is TV, radio, will defeat high culture, that's the postmodern artistic movement, by subsuming all culture within this kind of low cultural narrative, because it's easier to generate a profit from it. So in a sense, this is where the economic machine of capitalism kind of eats up the cultural machine. In the beginning, there may have been some possibility of escape without revolution, However, now as the beast becomes stronger and stronger, as the capitalist economic machine really starts turning up and accelerating its modes of mass production, it becomes harder and harder with every passing year for people to escape this kind of mass-produced advertising culture, because not only does it take over the way that things, goods and services are produced, but it takes over the way in which culture itself is produced, until culture itself is no longer culture. Culture itself is now a function of the economic machine rather than a critique of it. Some practical examples of this could be things like a university, which, to be fair to the university system, has in some senses tried to fight back against it, but in many respects higher education is now no longer about thinking, critical thinking, teaching, but of copying and memorizing. Even insofar as critical thinking itself is, people are trying to bring it back, to force kids into thinking or whatever. The actual teaching of critical thinking paradoxically prevents critical thinking, because critical thinking by its very definition ought to be something original, unique, and not enforced upon by ideology or preconditioned institutions. But we have things like, in England, for example, A-level critical thinking, whatever that is. It's one of the exams that the kids can now take. It's teaching them how to think critically. Could anything be more patronizing than that? So everyone now is kind of mathematically minded, but there's no actual kind of aesthetic philosophy in people's thinking. Even philosophy itself, or postmodern, post-industrial philosophy, has now kind of become a branch of science or linguistics. There's no kind of political philosophy in the sense of Plato, Aristotle, and Marx. Even political philosophy has been subsumed now as a branch of economics or political economy. So for Adorno, like I say, he's very pessimistic. This late capitalism is the beginning of the end of human creativity. Enslavement becomes more and more encroaching on us psychologically, and the end of independent thinking. So the future will be nothing more than computers, robots, and copying. And I think his social analysis could be never more true than today in the 21st century, where now we also have things like artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, blockchain. These technologies are simply going to add to the problem. So our lives become more convenient, but they lack meaning. So at the price of convenience, we lose the actual meaning and the sentience of life itself. This is a short introduction to Marxist critical and literary theory.